Welcome back to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined as always by my co-host Ben Anderson, and we are back with another edition of CBB Rank Countdown. This time going from 40 to 36. We will get started in just a second, but just before we get started, I want to remind everyone, if you have found us and are not subscribed yet, we would really appreciate it if you could knock that out, because we're trying to get those numbers up by the start of the regular season. So once again, please subscribe. Costs nothing on your end. Helps us out a lot. We are cranking up the CBB Review Courtside Show, which is also on this YouTube channel. We have player interviews up there with Jared Bynum from Stanford, Jamison Battle from Ohio State. I just watched that one. That one's really good, among others. So that's other content you could see on this CBB Review channel. But in this episode, like I said, we're going to go from 40 to 36 on the countdown for team previews. Let's start with number 40. We have the Auburn Tigers. This is a well-established program, so if I were to tell you they're ranked 40th, that's probably underwhelming for Tigers fans. Ben, do you think this is a correct placement for the Tigers, or do you think they should be better?
As of now, I think this is an accurate, a fair, a reasonable placement. But I do like the potential that this Tigers team has, a lot more actually than the one we saw last year. For all that Wendell Green brought to the program, and for all that Wendell Green, how Wendell Green could go off on certain games, I do feel like he put sort of a ceiling on that Tiger program with him being the main ball handler and the best player. And especially if Penny Hardaway, who's a 5-star recruit coming in, has the chops to play at an SEC level from day one, I really like the potential of this Tigers team. I think they're more well-rounded than last year's. But in my opinion, it all comes down to the shooting. If they're able to shoot, then they, are a top 25 team, or at least a top 25 caliber team. We just haven't seen that yet from Auburn.
Yeah, I think the point guards are the first point I want to bring up, because you have Holloway, who's the 16th ranked recruit, and he's not a projected one and done. I looked at a lot of NBA mock drafts. Most drafts don't really have him there, so he could be there for multiple years. Does KD Johnson get demoted to that bench spot? George does project that. KD Johnson is your real hit or miss player. One night he's the best player on the court. Another, he's jacking up a bunch of shots, going 3 for 13. Maybe Holloway is a little bit more consistent. I also think that's kind of Auburn's problem, or at least last year was their problem in general, was just having two different products of themselves on any given night. Actually, according to Haslametrics, they were bottom 15 in consistency in the country, which measures your deviation of performances on any given night. So I think the range of outcomes is wide for Auburn this season. Last year we saw that with the good. They beat Missouri by 33. They beat Tennessee at home. They beat Iowa in the tournament. And then they had disastrous losses like Georgia on the road. The Memphis loss, they looked really bad. They scored 43 against Tennessee. So maybe we see a little bit of a more rigid identity of Auburn this year.
Yeah, I hope so. And one last thing to point out, we haven't talked about him yet, but Janai Broome is a really good player for Auburn. I didn't necessarily know how he's going to transfer up from Morehead State after only 1 year at a lower level, but he proved his worth definitely in the post last year, and look for him to even be a little bit better, probably looking at like a 16-10 type season, honestly, is on the table for Broome. So to have that piece down low on what we think of typically as a guard-oriented team is really important, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's the most reliable guy you've got. You've got Absolutely. Your double machine, really reliable, especially on offense. And another point I want to bring up actually is the lower level transfers, because this is the first time that Bruce Pearl has really relied on that in building a roster. But such is today's landscape in college basketball. I'm glad he was willing to do that. Denver Jones is the guy that is probably going to start right away. I think almost definitely. Scored over 20 points per game at FIU. And the storyline we always give with that is you're going from FIU to Auburn. So it's a bigger upgrade of a conference, bigger upgrade of competition. So that's not going to translate, but I still think he should be a real significant piece. I mean, 20 points per game at Division I level and not a horrible conference. So they also have 3 depth pieces from JUCO and the D2 level. So I was really interested to see Pearl do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we don't really necessarily see from this level of power conference contender, especially with the two JUCOs and the D2 transfer. But overall, it's a really intriguing team. I think that's the best way to put the Tigers right now.
All right, number 39, we've got the Providence Friars. Another interesting rank because Ed Cooley is gone and they bring in Kim English. And Kim English is such an interesting topic of conversation because in the college basketball world, he is so highly regarded. Anybody that's played for him, anybody that has coached with him, that has been around him, just raves about how much potential he has. But in reality, we have not quite seen that come into fruition, even in his couple years at George Mason. But still, that reputation, that potential that he has, was good enough to get him the promotion. And also, you look at this Providence roster, and you wouldn't be able to tell that there's a coaching change because they really they have a lot of returning talent. You'll talk about those guys in specific, but it's just the question is, will English maximize that? Because he has not really maximized his George Mason talent, in my opinion.
No, I agree with that. And to Kim English's defense, it's not as if George Mason is the easiest job in the world. It's in the A10, which has been down the last couple of years, and it's not a top job in that conference. So that's something to consider here. But it is a relatively large jump for someone that it's only in their third season as a head coach and doesn't have a ton of experience outside of 2 middling years with the Patriots. What I like about Providence is I think that they have a really high floor. And that comes down to what they return, mainly the duo that you see up on the screen in Bryce Hopkins and Devin Carter. They ran that Providence team last year, even though they're missing some pieces, like they lost Ed Croswell and Noah Locke and Jared Bynum. Carter and Hopkins were the two most important players on that team, and to see them in return as opposed to hitting the transfer portal and joining Ed Cooley and Georgetown was huge for English and Providence. The question for me is the depth, right? That's something I'm a little bit worried about. When you look down the projected rotation, guys like Jaden Pierre only averaged 11 minutes per game. All of a sudden, he's going to be the projected starting point guard. Ticket Gaines, great name, but he only averaged 7 points per game at George Mason, right? One name to note here, I put that on the screen, is Garwi Duel. I think he has a lot of potential. People are really high on him. Whenever a medium personality goes and sees a Providence practice, they always end up raving about him as a true freshman. So that's something to keep an eye on as well for depth purposes.
Yeah, and Hopkins especially, like he could be preseason player of the year. I think you did bring up that inexperience in terms of the bench and the point guard position, especially. The fact that Devin Carter is such a capable ball handler does help, and I really am going to be interested in how lineup construction goes this year. I think we also know this will be a tough team. Lots of good rebounding. That was a staple of their team last year. But we'll just have to see if Kim English's reputation is correct. And if it is, I think they have a good year. And I don't know if this is good news or bad news, but it's news. Their non-conference schedule is pretty loaded. They've got Wisconsin. They've got Kansas State and then potentially Miami in the Bahamas. They're going to Oklahoma in the Big 12. That's a win that Oklahoma would love to get. We project them 7th in the Big East. That seems fair to me.
Yeah, I agree. It's a really tough Big East this year, especially at the top. So if they can make waves, maybe end up as like getting a double bye, I think it is in the Big East. If you finish top 4, that's really super impressive in the first year. But it's not something I necessarily expect.
We're going to keep moving. Let's go to 38. This is a team I would love to talk about. The Indiana Hoosiers. Last year, they won a lot of games. 6 quad 1 wins, just 2 losses outside of quad 1. Their resume was really good. They lose a lot. That's really the bottom line here. Trace Jackson Davis was the lifeblood of that team, their leading scorer by far. He's gone. Jalen Hood Schifino, second leading scorer, is gone. Miller Kopp, third leading scorer, is gone. Race Thompson, fourth leading scorer, is gone. In other words, they are second to last in Torvik, and you wrote that down the slide. Second to last in Torvik in the Big Ten in returning minutes. Ben, how do you see them replacing these minutes? Is 38 a fair ranking?
I think 38 is a fair ranking for now, but sort of not necessarily in a similar vein to Auburn, but good Lord, if the front court potential of Indiana hits, then that is going to be an extremely dangerous team. A lot of people have been talking about Malik Renew as this breakout potential All-American player. As a sophomore, he didn't do a ton as a freshman, but again, like you mentioned, it was a loaded team, especially in the front court with Thompson and Trace Jackson Davis. So if he can come out and have the potential that everyone thinks he does, then that's a real steal for Mike Woodson to keep him back for a second year. But the main story here is probably Khalil Ware. He's a former 5-star player who transferred in from Oregon after having limiting playing time under Dana Altman over there. But the ceiling is sky high for him. He's an elite rim protector. And if he has a little bit more usage rate on the offensive end, I think he could turn into a 10.8 rebound type guy, which is exactly what this team needs. And then finally, you're bringing in Mackenzie Mbako, former Duke commit, number 10 overall recruit in the country, moved over here after a couple of roster changes for the Blue Devils. So he is a Hoosier now. Again, if all of those 3 players hit, which I don't think is out of the question, out of the realm of possibility, then this all of a sudden becomes a very dangerous team in the Big Ten.
And yeah. I'm not alone in this, but Mackenzie Mbako, he is just he has every sort of shot in his arsenal at 6'8". There's a reason he's supposed to be not supposed to be, but potentially could be a top 10 pick. And I think what we will see out of this team is really good shooting. Like last year, you got Johnson, who I'll talk about in a second. He's a polarizing player, but he's a good shooter. You got Trey Galloway. He's a good shooter. That's your starting backcourt right there, most likely. So you got those 2. And then I've talked about Mbako, Gabe Cupps, fringe top 100 true freshman, but that's a guy that we have projected coming off of the bench, really being a sniper there. That will be important for them. But another key storyline, you have the younger guys, the raw potential that you talked about. Will they hit? Will they not hit? But Xavier Johnson, I think, is also a key storyline we need to discuss. Last year, he was injured and sidelined early, but even before that was the case, he was a source of frustration with a lot of Indiana fans, kind of similar to what happened with his Pitt days. He'll be an important piece, for this year for their team. I think he'll rack up the counting stats, but how efficient is he, right? Does he handle the ball well enough to avoid disastrous nights? And that's my question with him. But I think this team has a lot of talent, a lot of interesting pieces. There's some question marks how this plays out, but then you resort kind of to the head coach. And I really like Mike Woodson. He hasn't been doing it at that level for so long, but his first 2 years have indicated a lot of good things to me.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. One last point out, I think this is a wide range of outcomes for this Indiana team. It could go really well. It could also go really poorly. They could miss the tournament. I would not be shocked at all, in my opinion. I do worry a little bit about their backcourt depth. You mentioned Galloway and Johnson as starters, but after that, it's do we really know what's going to happen if Gabe Cupps is your third guard off the bench? Or if Gabe Cupps is your third guard, that's a little bit concerning if you're Indiana. But overall, I mean, if the talent hits, if the ceiling hits, this was a super dangerous team.
We have them as 7th in the Big Ten. They could be like top 5, I'll say. Top 5 they could be.
Here's the thing. I don't think they're going to finish 7th. I think they're either going to finish 3rd or they're going to finish 10th or something like that. Yeah.
There's some good teams at the top of the Big Ten. There's also some teams that I think will have absolute horrible years, but
yeah,
that was more in the past. We've talked about those teams weeks ago, but let's move on. We got another team in the Big Ten who, honestly, I think we if I were doing this, I'd reverse these rankings at least, but let's talk about them. Northwestern has Chris Collins as their head coach, who is widely considered the best coach in modern Northwestern basketball history. And it's kind of crazy because he's only made 2 tournaments in 9 years, but 2 tournaments in 9 years at Northwestern is actually quite admirable. So do you think he makes it 3 in 10 years, Ben?
I don't. I think that might be a hot take, but I see this and it looks very similar to their team last year, except they don't have Chase Audiege, right? Mm-hmm. And that is a big loss. I don't think people are really worried, showing enough concern about, because I don't necessarily see a replacement. I will say Brooks Barnhizer has the potential to be a big breakout star in the Big Ten. He is that long wing that people are looking for that can shoot it a little bit as well. He's just a versatile player at the 3 or the 4 spot. But Audiege was a scorer, man. And the reason the team worked so well, or so well is relative, but the reason the team worked so well last year is because he and Bowie, even if one of them had an off night, the other was going to pick up the slack. Now I'm not really sure if that's going to be the case. If Bowie ends up going like 4 for 17 in one game, who is that second scorer that can pick up the points that Bowie left on the floor? Bowie, obviously an absolutely excellent player. I mean, you have to be one to average 17 in the Big Ten, especially at Northwestern. But I don't know. I don't know if this is going to be a tournament team.
So you also didn't mention Audiege on the defensive end because he was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. I think that's honestly where it's going to hurt the most, because if you look in a world where Northwestern replicates what they do last year, I think it's because they're a top 15, top 20 defensive team in the country. And you're losing Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. That will hurt. But also the rest of their roster, they do return a good bit. We talked about Indiana being towards the bottom of the Big Ten in terms of returning production. Northwestern's towards the top. So that's definitely encouraging. And the guys they are returning are role players. I do see what you're saying. I do see what you're saying, because who's that X factor guy, right? I see this as a bubble team because they don't really have a lot of holes, and I think even the lower major transfers that they're bringing in will even help that out even more. They got Ryan Langborg from Princeton and Justin Mullins from Denver, and those could help Northwestern in the outside shooting department. Neither of them are lights out shooters, but both of them are well above what their team average was last year. That was a major problem for Northwestern. So if they shoot a little better, that could account for a little bit of a defensive drop off. But if Northwestern is the best version of themselves this year, it's because the defense comes together.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just worry about the versatility, and I worry about the scoring offensively, because it's going to be really hard in a good Big Ten to be able to defense your way into the tournament, in my opinion, at least this year.
Yeah. All right. You ready to talk about our last team of the night? This one we might.
I'm sure this will get people talking, right?
Yeah. Okay. 36 Memphis Tigers. There has been absolutely no absence of controversy once again with Penny Hardaway's Memphis. He will be suspended for the first 3 games for recruiting violations, one of which is against the Missouri Tigers, which are 42nd in our CBB rank. The other 2, I believe, are bye games. But in addition, they have Jaquan Walton and Mikey Williams on the roster. Both have recently dealt with some criminal records. Williams is still working out some things. But when it comes to what's on the court, there's another question mark. And that is DeAndre Williams, not who he is as a player, because I think if he gets the waiver, he's your AAC preseason player of the year. But will he get that waiver? Because if not, Memphis has 0 returning starters. So there's really a lot up in the air. Ben, where do you want to go first with this Memphis team and dissecting them?
Well, in my opinion, I think there's only one place to go, and that is the age of this team.
Yeah.
Right? Senior, graduate, senior, graduate, senior, top 8, graduate, senior, excuse me. Can't forget about Malcolm Dandridge, right? You're playing like 22-year-olds straight across the board here, whether or not Mikey Williams comes in as a freshman. And if you want to bring DeAndre Williams back in, he's 26 right now? Is that his age? It's something crazy like that, right? So even though they don't have any starters returning, this is an old team with a lot of experience at the highest level of college basketball. Even though Jordan Brown's coming in from Louisiana Lafayette, he was a 5-star coming out of high school. He was committed to Arizona, spent some time in Nevada as well, I believe. Like, he's bounced around, but he has the talent, right? Javon Quinterly, also a 5-star, even though he's bounced around. Caleb Mills spent time at Florida State and Houston, right? Two really good programs. So I think that they have a lot of opportunity to be really successful here. The question is, how is it all going to blend together, especially with all these guys that are typically number one or number two options, and you can't fit five number one and number two options on the court at one time.
Yeah, it'll be a big matter of establishing roles. I'm not sure this Memphis team is capable. Maybe they are, and I hope they are, but there's no previous evidence. In fact, there's previous evidence in the contrary in determining in the fact that they do piece it all together, a lot of talent, but a lot of roles to fill in. And we talk about the 1 through 3. I'll talk about those guys. We got Quinterly, we got Caleb Mills, we got David Jones. I don't really like Mills and Jones, to be honest. I think those are guys that had impressive counting stats, but it's a matter of when you're on a losing team or a winning team, somebody has to get the points, and those are players from schools that lost a lot of games last year. I do like Quinterly a lot. He has not really lived up to his full potential at Alabama, but coming off of an SEC sixth man of the year, and now you're coming down to play a lead role for an American athletic team. I think that's a formula for a really, really good season. Whether or not there's DeAndre Williams there as well, that determines a lot. So,
yep.
Like, I guess 36 is just like what the median of the millions of outcomes that could happen with Memphis this year.
Yeah, I feel like that's a lot of the teams in this one, but it's sort of like, yeah, I guess we'll put it there. And then there's one last thing I want to say here. You pointed it out that they are still in the American Athletic Conference, and you know who's not in the American Athletic Conference anymore? Houston and Cincinnati, right? So all of a sudden, this conference is Memphis to lose, right? Pretty clearly. So even though that this might not be the peak Memphis teams that we've seen in the past, they're still very clearly the most talented in the conference, and they should win it, in my opinion.
FAU does join the AAC. Remember that.
I did forget about FAU. I'm glad you brought that up. So they are the best historical program pretty clearly in the AAC. With this FAU team this year, this might give them some hiccups, but looking forward, I do think, considering Dusty May will likely not be long for the FAU job, this will be the program to beat.
Yeah, as far as 2023 to 24 is concerned, FAU has a lot fewer question marks. I think.
Is true. Yeah, slipped my mind that they moved over from CUSA.
Yeah, the biggest redeeming quality of FAU is the fact that they have so few question marks, and we'll talk about FAU in a future episode. But the point is, Memphis, I think second in the American is very appropriate. The question is, are they closer to FAU? Are they closer to that second tier with the UABs and the North Texases of the world? That's to be determined.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that will do it for today's edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our channel once again. We have so much content churning out there, and there'll be a lot more with the start of the regular season. So be sure to knock that out. Thank you guys so much for watching and listening, and take care.